Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from AnthonyMorganti.com. You may remember that a few weeks ago I did an unboxing video of some product I received from B&H Photo, that being a Sony A7S II mirrorless camera and a Sony 24-70 f4 lens. I mentioned in that video that I was going to be doing a follow-up video talking more specifically about the camera and lens. I kind of thought about it, how was I going to do this video? I'm kind of new to product reviews and I was wondering, should I get real technical about the camera? How specific should I talk about settings and things like that? And I really think the best way for me to do a product review is to really compare the product to stuff I'm used to. So that's why you see a Fujifilm X-T1 camera here. So I'm going to talk about the Sony camera and lens, and I'm going to compare it to some of the other things I've used. Now, before I really get into it, I again would like to thank B&H Photo for loaning me the equipment, specifically Izzy over there at B&H Photo for hooking me up with the stuff. As a photography teacher, I truly believe that I'm a better teacher when I get to use other equipment, because many times our opinions get skewed by the equipment we use, and frequently my student is using something totally different than what I'm using, and this way I get a better idea of what they're up against when they're using specific types of equipment. So sincerely, I thank B&H for loaning me the equipment, and in the description below will be links to everything I talk about, so you could check it out over there at B&H. Okay, now, when I mentioned that I was getting this camera and lens and I did the unboxing, one criticism I got was the lens. A lot of people were shocked that I would get this lens because it's not very highly reviewed on the internet. Really, I thought the lens was good. I mean, I wouldn't call it great. To compare it, I mean, my Nikon 24-70 f2.8 lens is superior to this lens. This lens is very good though, very, very good. If you're out shooting landscapes, this lens will be fine. It works very well. There are some great landscape photographers that use this lens almost exclusively. Matt Kluskowski comes to mind, Trey Ratcliffe comes to mind. They use this lens and their images speak for themselves. So I thought the lens is nice. I thought it worked very well. It focuses very well. Well, I'll talk about more focus in a minute. Now, my Nikons focus a little better, but like I said, we'll get to that a little more specifically in a minute. So I really like the lens. It is plastic and it's kind of a little cheap feeling compared to the camera. The camera is really solid. And you know, so the lens, I think if you bumped it and stuff, you might have a problem. But I thought it worked well overall, and throughout this video I will be showing you images that I took with the camera and lens so you get a better idea of how this combo works out. Now, as for the camera itself, some things I've read on the internet before I ever started using the camera, some complaints about the camera, was the menu system was complicated. I didn't think so. I thought the menu system was pretty intuitive. It's a lot of stuff. They have a lot of options for this camera. So maybe that's it. There's just so much you can control with the camera. The menu system is very in-depth. I wouldn't call it complicated though. I think it's laid out really nice, and it just, to me, was very intuitive. So I appreciated the menu system. The other thing is focus. Mirrorless cameras inherently don't focus quite as efficiently as a DSLR, all right? It just has to do with the physical way they achieve focus compared to a DSLR. Now, what I found was, now of course the lens has a lot to do with, okay, the way or how efficient it will focus, how quickly it will grab focus. So, you know, take that too into consideration. But when I compare it to my Fujifilm X-T1, this focuses, the Sony focuses better when you're using AF-C. So continuous focus, the Sony works a little better. They both do not work as well as either of my Nikon cameras, the D7000 or the D800E. those on continuous focus are far superior to either of these cameras. What these mirrorless cameras do, and I think it's common with most mirrorless cameras that I've worked with at least, is when you're using continuous focus, they tend to oscillate. So when you're holding the shutter in halfway way as you're focusing, or you're using a back button to hold focus, theoretically, with continuous focus, as an object is moving about and you keep your focus point on that object that is moving around, you should continually stay in focus with that object. Both of these cameras are about equal in tracking a moving subject, but where they kind of fail is when the subject is still and you're using continuous focus, they tend to oscillate. The Fuji oscillates a tiny bit more than this camera does, but this one still oscillates. So it's kind of like going in and out of focus with, you know, just very slowly. I don't know how else to explain it. So it's just, you could even hear it going focus, you know, in and out, in and out, in and out. So that is annoying to me because I like to use continuous focus on my cameras. But still, this one's a little better than the Fuji. Now, for single focus, where you're just going to focus and usually the camera will beep to let you know that you're in focus, the Fuji is better than the Sony. The Sony often, if I had a smooth surface and I was trying to focus on that smooth surface, it couldn't focus. It would not focus. There were a couple times when I was out, I was focusing on the sidewalk. So it's like a flat, smooth surface. This couldn't achieve focus. And by the way, when I went out shooting, I brought both, and I took images with this and this at the same time. So I take a shot with this, then I take the same exact shot with this. This, the Fujifilm X-T1, and by the way, I have the Fujifilm 16 to 55 millimeter f/2.8 lens on here, which is roughly the same angle of view as the 24 to 70 on a full frame camera. This one is an angle of view of 24 to 82.5. So it's roughly the same, but a little faster though lens. But for single focus, the Fuji was superior. Grab focus every time. It didn't matter if I was on a flat white wall. This one would focus. This one wouldn't. It would bop in and out. So focus is an issue, but it's not just to Sony. I think most mirrorless cameras don't focus quite as well as a DSLR, like my D800E or my D7000 that I often use. Now, after focus, I think what people complain about is the viewfinder, because again, with a mirrorless camera, you can't use an optical viewfinder. It has to use an electronic viewfinder. I actually thought the electronic viewfinder was awesome in this camera. When Fuji came out with the X-T1, it got rave reviews for the electronic viewfinder, saying it was the best viewfinder ever for a mirrorless camera. I say the Sony is the equal. The electronic viewfinder on the Sony is just as good as the electronic viewfinder in the X-T1. That's my opinion. I think it's really a nice viewfinder. Now, a couple things that I found with it that I didn't care for. There's a lot of distortion. Now I know that that is inherent to a lens, but I'm not talking about like specific distortions that might be inherent to a specific type of lens, a specific brand of lens or make a lens. I'm talking about the wide angle distortion. When you're at 24 millimeters on this camera, because it's full frame and because it's mirrorless, and if you're like framing the subject and you have verticals like buildings on the outside parts of the frame, and you happen to not have the horizon right in the middle, you're tilted up, let's say, so you're trying to get a beautiful sky in the shot. The buildings tilt in a lot. I mean a lot. Way more than, well, this is a crop sensor, so it's not a fair comparison. A crop sensor camera won't do that as much. This one barely does it, but my D800E with the Nikon 24 to 70 f/2.8 lens, way less than this camera, way less. And that is inherent to a mirrorless full frame camera. And if you read the article over there at Petapixel, I'm sorry, that talks about, the guy talked about why he made a mistake going with a Sony full frame camera. And they talked about how the sensor is so big and the actual hole where the lens goes on is small compared to other cameras, that there's a lot of inherent distortion on the edges of the frame. And I think they interviewed an executive from Sigma that talked about it, and I think an executive from Fuji also talked about it too. So that is a problem with a Sony full frame camera, and I found it. Curiously, when lens corrections are enabled, it doesn't totally correct that. It's still there, and you have to sometimes manually go in to, say, Lightroom and try to correct and make sure that your verticals are indeed vertical and your horizontals are indeed horizontal. So my recommendation is, if you're a landscape photographer and you're doing like wild landscapes, when I say wild landscapes, I'm meaning just not cityscapes, this camera lens, everything, they'd be fine. It works great. I mean, Trey Radcliffe and Matt Kleskowski proved it. They have beautiful landscape images with this camera. They use, we'll talk about that more too. They use actually the A7R2, not the S2, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So, if you're a real estate photographer or you do cityscapes, I recommend that you do not go with a full frame mirrorless camera, at least these Sonys, because of that problem. You're going to get a lot of distortion on things that are on the outside. So if you're in like a real estate photographer and you're trying to do a room and you really need your corners to be straight and square, they're not going to be. They're just not going to be. And you're going to spend a lot of time in post-production making everything straight and square. So that is an issue that I found with the camera right off the bat. I noticed it right away. There's going to be images I'm showing you now where I took a cityscape and there's two buildings that are leaned in considerably on the outer side of the frame. Then when the lens corrections are already applied in Lightroom and they're still leaned in a lot. There's another one where I took an image of the Buffalo History Museum and I was down low shooting up. And when you do perspective correction in Lightroom, the pillars, which are all the same size on this building, get really distorted. And it's mainly because of this issue, because it's a full frame camera with a big sensor, and it has such a small hole for this wide angle of view to come through and then get refracted or reflected back out. So it hits all the corners of the sensor. So you tend to get all this distortion. So think of it this way. You have this wide angle of view and it all has to get funneled into this small hole. Then it has to come back and funnel out to hit the big sensor. So that's where you get this distortion around the outside, that things lean in and stuff like that. With a crop sensor camera, since the sensor's smaller, you don't have that issue. You're only grabbing the middle part of the frame, really. So you're not getting this distortion that could be on the outside. And then, of course, with the DSLR, the hole for the where the lens goes on is larger. The lens is further away from the sensor, so you don't have to bend the light as much, from layman terms, to try to speak of how that might cause this distortion. So that, to me, was quite an issue. Because I often photograph cityscapes, so that was an issue. Now, one thing I want to talk about is a resolution with the camera. Now, I hope you don't mind that I look down at my notes. The A7S2, it's a 12.2 megapixel camera. It's full frame sensor. It has a resolution of 4240 by 2832. Conversely, the Fujifilm X-T1, which is a crop sensor camera, is 16.3 megapixels, and it has a resolution of 4896 by 3264. So actually the resolution of this X-T1 is slightly greater than the resolution of this full-frame Sony. That's why I really don't want you to get hung up on full frame. Like, you want full frame just because you want full frame. Full frame doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have better resolution. Now, you can get better resolution with a full frame. For example, the A7R II, which is this one's brother, gets a resolution. Now, it's a 42.4 megapixel camera. That has a resolution of 7,952 by 5,304. So the resolution of the A7R II is much greater than this A7S II. My recommendation would be that if you really want the full frame camera, you really want a mirrorless full frame camera, of course you have to go with Sony, that you save the extra money and get the A7R II. It will give you a more resolute picture. Now, there's a lot of stuff that goes into resolution, obviously, not just what I mentioned, megapixels and the actual image size. But those are the two important things in my mind. So don't misquote me and say that Morganti said that megapixels and image size is everything about resolution, because not. There's a lot of other stuff. I mean, lenses have a lot to do with it. The way the sensors are made, not all sensors are equal. One 16 megapixel sensor may be better than another 16 megapixel sensor. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. But in my opinion, if you need a mirrorless camera, because this is really small and light, it is smaller and lighter than my crop sensor Fuji X-T1. So if you need the small light camera and you want a full frame sensor, get the one with the better resolution, the A7R II. All right, you're still going to get the same types of distortion that I talked about a minute ago, but you will get a more resolute picture. And what does a more resolute picture do for you? Well, for me, I need a high resolution image because I sell limited edition signed prints that are fairly large. And when you get a print, the bigger you need the print, the more resolute you need the image to start with. So if you have a really, I don't know, like a really small sensor camera with very low megapixels, you're going to have a very, very small image size. So you might, be 3,000 by 2,000 pixels, something like that. That's going to limit how big you could effectively print that image. The more resolute, the higher resolution image you have, the bigger the print you'll be able to create. So that is why resolution is important to me. Now, if you're the type of person, you're just taking pictures and putting them online, or you're doing some type of artwork with it that's online through Photoshop or something like that, this would work out great still. There's a lot of things about this camera. The bells and whistles I mentioned about in the menu system, you could do a lot of things. It shoots very high speed. The buffer is great. You could take a lot of images in a row, so you could just snap, put it on continuous shooting and just shoot a bunch of images in a row, and the buffer doesn't fill that readily. It's really great in that regard. So this might still be the camera for you, but in general, I recommend that you spend the extra money and get the A7R II over the A7S II if you have the extra money to spend. The other things that I found with it is the overall experience. Very similar to my Fuji X-T1, I thought. Just the feel of it, it's small, it's light. You could carry it. I know this one, as I mentioned, is heavier than this, but it's unobtrusive. I really like that footprint of the Sony, and it worked great. I was very, very satisfied with its performance. Like I mentioned, it doesn't focus quite as well in some instances, but I was really happy with the way it did perform overall. One thing about it that they tout, and you often hear about on the internet at least, is the high ISO performance. The ISO, the natural ISO of the A7S II is 100 ISO to 102,400 ISO. That is just stupendous. Now, the Fuji X-T1, on the other hand, is 200 to 6400. Now, both of these cameras have extended ISO, but I'm just talking about the native ISO. So this is like tremendously more effective at higher ISOs. Generally speaking, I don't like high ISO. Again, I'm going for the more resolute image. I try to keep my ISOs as low as possible. So that isn't something that I need. If you're a low light shooter and you can't use external flash or light banks or anything like that, then you'd probably really get the use out of this type of camera, these Sony cameras that have this super high extended ISO. So this one was, again, 100 ISO to 102,400. The A7R II is 100 to 25,600. So it's less, less on the upper end than this one. This one has tremendously high ISO performance. Will you still get noise? Yes, you're still going to get noise, but it tends to keep your color, the colors don't tend to shift as much, and it's a more acceptable image, generally speaking, because it could handle these higher ISOs. So that is really very, very impressive. But overall, like I said, I was really happy with the camera. Bottom line, to sum it all up and to probably repeat myself, if you are just looking for a camera that's going to give you a fairly resolute image that you could get fairly large prints, I really recommend that you get the Sony or the Fujifilm X-T1. The Fujifilm X-T1 is going to give you 16.3 megapixels. It's going to give you a resolution of 4896 by 3264. So this camera is going to give you more resolution than this camera. If you're going to be doing cityscapes, real estate photography, I recommend that you don't get the Sony. You're better off with the Fuji. Crop sensor camera is going to give you straighter verticals, and the horizontals, your squares, corners are going to be more square with these wider angle lenses like this one, the 16 to 55 millimeter lens, or the 23 millimeter lens that I often use. So my recommendations, if you're doing that type of photography, get this. This is roughly a third of the cost of this, and in many ways it's better. On the other hand, if you're doing landscapes, sports photography, things where you're going to need like a fairly large buffer, you're going to be shooting off a lot of images, then you may want the A7R II. The A7R II, well, let me back up a little minute. If you're doing sports photography, the A7S II would be great because the buffer has great high ISO performance, and the buffer doesn't fill up that readily, so you could go in continuous shooting mode and just shoot off a bunch of images, and your buffer won't fill up that readily. This one would work great for that regard. Most sport images you're not going to be blowing up really large. They're for internet use, for newspapers at the most, maybe to be printed. So this one would work great. If you're doing landscapes, on the other hand, and you have wildlife photography, you might be getting some large prints. I recommend the A7R II over this. Of course, it does cost considerably more. If you don't have that much money to spend, the X-T1 works great. Fuji has some new lenses out for that are longer that you could do sport photography and wildlife photography with. They just came out with an X Pro 2. The X Pro 2 is 24.3 megapixels and has a resolution of 6,000 by 4,000. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So it's not as good as the A7R II, but it's still pretty good. Never used that camera though, so I want to state that. So overall, I was pretty satisfied with the camera, and I was actually surprisingly satisfied with the lens. I think for my type of shooting, an A7R II would be better for me if I were to buy one. But I could see, as I mentioned in some instances, sport photography specifically, maybe photojournalism, the A7S II would probably be a better choice. If, again, you're not hung up on getting a full frame camera, the Fujifilm X-T1 would probably be the better choice because it's cheaper. You're just going to save a lot of money. So that's it. Again, I'd like to really thank Izzy over there at B&H Photo for loaning me the camera. I really do appreciate it. And guys, if you could click through using the links below, that will do two things. First of all, I am an affiliate for B&H, so I will make a small commission if you purchased anything. And that does help me make all these free videos and keep pretty much everything I do about photography free. So that is through the help you give me by using my affiliate links. But really, more importantly than that, it lets B&H know that you appreciate that they're loaning me this equipment to review. So that's it on this camera. Thank you everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.